Now, it's been a big week in US politics. Super Tuesday set up an all but certain election rematch between Donald Trump and Joe Biden after Nikki Haley suspended her campaign.
And President Joe Biden also delivered his highly anticipated State of the Union address. Late Show host Stephen Colbert says President Biden was set one challenge for the speech.
Now, coming into tonight's speech, critics said Biden's State of the Union challenge was to dispel old man vibes. Really? In Congress? Kind of hard to fight off the old man vibe when you're speaking to a room that looks like an open casket convention.
Right, let's now bring in the co-host of the ABC's Planet America, John Barron. John, great to have you in the studio.
Morning.
So this was essentially seen, the State of the Union, as a bit of a job interview for this election rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Did he manage what Stephen Colbert was saying, to not give off these old man vibes?
Well, I'd say, Joe, his vibe was old man trying not to look like an old man or sound like an old man. His voice was much stronger. Biden can often be reduced to kind of a hoarse whisper, and that's partly because, as we know from his extensive medical reports released just last week, that he suffers from reflux that affects his voice, apparently. Well, he'd taken some antacid and he was out there in full voice, and it was vintage Joe Biden. We have to remember that Joe Biden spent 36 years as a senator. He's used to standing up there and berating his Republican rivals and sometimes his Democratic colleagues, telling them what they should do about this bill or this bit of legislation. So he was very much in his element and much higher energy than he often is.
And some of the Republicans gave it back to him a bit. There's a bit of heckling from the crowd as well. And it's interesting, this was quite political, this State of the Union, but it's interesting that Joe Biden didn't mention Donald Trump by name at all.
Not by name, but repeatedly as my predecessor. It was a very calculated attack on Donald Trump. This is unusual for a State of the Union. It is constitutionally a report from the President to the Congress about the State of the Union. It's required on an annual basis. Sometimes in the old days it was done in written forms. In the last century it's been mostly delivered as a speech. But it is usually a very formal, very ceremonial sort of a speech. This was a very political speech. It was a campaign speech. He could have given this same speech at the Democratic Convention. There were lines in it which he has been giving in speeches for years and years, talking about growing the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down, a phrase that he has used hundreds and hundreds of times. But when he's talking about Donald Trump, he was essentially drawing a direct line between Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin and Adolf Hitler. And he was saying that just as democracy and freedom is under threat in Europe as a result of Putin, it is under threat in America as a result of my predecessor. The fact that Trump was such a feature in this, of course, is the fact that this is a later than usual State of the Union. They often happen in January. This is happening in early March. And we already know that Donald Trump is going to be the Republican presidential nominee again this year for the third consecutive time. So he had a very specific target. He wasn't just criticising Republicans generally. It was Trump, but as you say, not by name.
He did speak about Roe v. Wade and promised to restore it as the law of the land if voters send him a Congress that supports that. I mean, that's a big if, given the makeup of Congress.
It's a practical impossibility at this stage. In order to codify the rights to access to abortion up to a certain number of weeks, it would require 60 votes in the Senate. At the moment, Democrats have 51. They'll be lucky if they hold on to those 51 at November's elections. They're more likely, given that a third of the Senate is up every 2 years, that's a 6-year term, it's more likely that the Republicans will gain a majority in the Senate, even if the Democrats manage to win back the House of Representatives. So the President alone can only sign a law into law, like our Governor-General does. They can't pass a law. It's up to their party if they have the numbers. He won't have the numbers. There is no prospect of that, but he will campaign for it and hope that, well, maybe it wins him an extra Senate seat or two, and possibly in the midterms of 2026, if he is re-elected, they could get closer again. But in a practical sense, it is not likely, in the same way as all the talk on the other side, the Republican side, about imposing a national abortion ban, saying saying at some other point, maybe beyond 6 weeks or 12 weeks or 16 weeks, no state can allow abortions. That similarly is just not going to happen unless they get 60 votes, which again is highly, highly unlikely.
Now, it has been a big week in US politics, not just with the State of the Union, but also with Super Tuesday. And we've seen through the primaries and caucuses that there is this strong group of Republicans that don't lean towards Donald Trump. Nikki Haley supporters, now that she is out of the race, where do you think they will go? Because they're sort of up for grabs, but how big a voter bloc is that?
Well, Nikki Haley was getting anywhere from around sort of 16, 17% up to as much as close to 50% in one or two primaries. She won one state and the District of Columbia, but lost the rest. Her voters, though, if you look at who they were, Joe, a lot of them are independents. They identify as independents rather than as Democrats or Republicans, and a number of them were indeed Democrats who were taking part in the Republican primary to damage Donald Trump. But more than a third of her voters were Republicans. Now, do those Republicans, as they say, come home to the party and vote for Donald Trump in November? Or, if they were not attracted to Donald Trump in the primary, are they now not going to be attracted to him in November? That is the big question, and the question probably upon which the entire election will turn. Those Republicans that don't like Donald Trump but may be inclined to support him over Joe Biden, well, we'll see if they're a significant number. But this is an election that is likely to be decided by maybe 100,000 votes. Out of 150 million cast, and it will come down to 20 or 30,000 votes in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona. That'll decide the election. That's the sort of margin we've been talking about in most elections in the last quarter century.
Amazing to think about those numbers. John Barron from Planet America, always great to speak to you. I'm sure we'll speak to you a lot more between now and November. Thanks,
Joe.